Hi guys! First of all, I am not native speaker, I'm just learning, so I'm sorry for advance in my mistakes and accent. But anyway, let's begin. Not long ago I watched Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, and I was excited to see how the screenwriters are developing the concept of villains in superhero movies. Before, Marvel had many absurd and unrealistic stereotyped villains, but now things are changing, and it's like a train slowly moving forward. Villains are becoming more deep and intriguing. It's cool to see how they are no longer simply evil for no reason. Instead, their characters are being explored in depth, which makes the movies more interesting for a wider audience. For example, Ozymandias, who prevented nuclear destruction by uniting people against a common enemy.
Do you see? Two superpowers retreating from war. I've saved the Earth from hell. We both have.
Or Wanda lost her love and children, and in her quest to get them back, she goes deeper into darkness.
Well, you can kiss the lunchbox goodbye, because that's the kind of justification our enemies use.
Is it the one you used? When you gave Thanos the Time Stone? You break the rules and become a hero. I do it and I become the enemy. That doesn't seem fair.
Or Magneto, who fights to protect his race and their rights, even if his methods can be very rough.
They will draw first blood. They will force their cure upon us.
But what I love even more is when stories don't have definite villains. Like Miguel from the new Spider-Man, who is the main antagonist but not truly a villain or anti-hero. His goal is justified, he wants to protect the universes from destruction. There's also Spot, who is not a villain either. He's more like a comic character and never intended to cause harm to anyone. Today I want to talk to you about villains and heroes. What are the three ways to become a villain? And why are there even fewer ways to become a hero? Why did they choose their paths? And do people truly have the freedom to choose between the path of light or darkness? It's easy to decide who is the hero and who's the villain without considering their upbringing. Some might say that growing up in good conditions make you good, while a tough upbringing leads to being bad. A classic example is Kingpin, who first appeared in Spider-Man comics and became one of the main enemies. He grew up in difficult circumstances, with little known about his parents. His father was described as a drug addict or a criminal, and his mother as a prostitute. Additionally, as he lived in a criminal district, it's not surprising that he committed his first murder at just 12 years old. However, he was ambitious and curious, with no money for education, so he started to steal textbooks and magazines. He was particularly interested in political schemes and manipulations that he could apply in practice. Observing small gangs, Kingpin learned how to control criminals, and then, when a head of the mafia took an interest in him, he was fully immersed in a gangster life. Unfortunately, there was no one around Kingpin to guide his talents and innate ambitions towards something good. On the other hand, we have Matt Murdock, whose life was far from easy. He lost his sight and his father was killed by gangsters. The place he grew up was far from pleasant, with constant gang fights, robberies and drug trade. In such circumstances, one might think he'd become a gangster, but he went another way. Matt was raised in Catholic Church, where doing good was preached. His father taught him to do the right thing. Seeing the injustice around him and knowing how much he could do about it, following his father's and the church teachings, he became a lawyer and simultaneously put on the daredevil costume. Now let's look from the other side. It might seem that growing up in good conditions influences moral compass in a good way. Take Mr. Fantastic, one of Spider-Man's closest allies. He was raised by his scientist father, Nathaniel Richards, who recognized his son's exceptional intellect and always supported him. This approach was so effective that Reed Richards finished school at 14 and attended 4 prestigious universities at the same time. It sounds like both my nightmare and my dream at the same time. After getting a dose of cosmic radiation, he and 3 friends gained superpowers. So they formed the Fantastic Four. Reed grew up in a fine environment, became a good person and logically became a hero. But here is another example, Harry Osborn. He was Peter Parker's friend and one of those who wore the Green Goblin mask. He was the son of wealthy man and he had everything: money, intelligence and even friends in the comics and a couple of animated series. But he lacked something that Richards had: a good father. Norman Osborn is quite a weird character, and his backstory was rewritten so many times that it's hard to tell if he was a lunatic, a genius, a crazy genius, or someone who made a deal with Mephisto. But in any case, he was often neglectful and rarely paid attention to his son. Harry constantly tried to prove his love.
Everyone heard that creep.
The creep is my father, alright? If I'm lucky, I'll become half of what he is.
But his father remained oblivious and even mocked him at times.
What, you want me to trade in my car for a Jetta just because you flunked out of every private school I ever sent you to?
It wasn't for me.
Of course it was.
He compared him to Peter Parker and said, "Look son, your friend is successful and you're just a loser, a junkie."
It's not the first time I've been proven wrong. Congratulations. Peter, the Science Award. That's terrific.
Yeah.
I know this has been a difficult time for you, but I want you to try to enjoy this day. Commencement. The end of one thing, the start of something new.
Yes, in the comics, Harry really started to use drugs, trying to escape reality. After his father's death, he became mad, and he put on the Green Goblin costume, driven by hate for Spider-Man and Peter Parker, especially when Peter stole Mary Jane from him. Not the one you might think, but another. So while it might seem that good or bad surroundings shape a person, I believe it just forms our style, coping mechanisms and so on. What really determines whether a person becomes a hero or villain is the influence of the closest people who raise him.
Maybe if I'd raised you, I could have made you better, and not some weak, sniveling pussy starved for attention.
You.
I know. You're a fucking disappointment.
However, this leads us to an interesting thought, that in fact heroes and villains might not have had a choice. They are products of their environment and upbringing. Of course, this doesn't apply all the time. A person's own character can also influence their life, and there are always exceptions and so on. Yet, the predominant influence, unfortunately or fortunately, is still from the environment and upbringing. The question is, how interesting are these characters? For me, they're usually a 5 of 10. On one hand, you feel sorry for them and understand that they couldn't have turned out differently. They had no choice and nothing to compare with, to understand that their path wasn't the only one. On the other hand, such villains aren't much different from those who are simply evil just because they are evil. The same goes for heroes. I am good just because I had good parents and friends. Let's admit it, that's just boring. However, in the end, it feels like they have a lack of free will. You might say it's just their childhood and they need to accept it and move on. People should become independent and choose who they want to be in adulthood. But what if I tell you that nothing really changes? Because there is always the possibility of world-changing event, or as Miguel said, canon event. In comics, there is a thing called the canon event. It's that moment that pushes characters to heroship or evilness. You know what I mean, like the death of Batman's parents or the Joker's falls in acid and all that stuff. And Spider-Man's classic enemies are good examples of these canon events. We are talking about those who literally lost their minds. Let's start with one who has recently been placed at the top of the list of Spider-Man's enemies, Dr. Octopus. Otto Octavius was a nuclear physicist who wanted to discover new sources of energy for the benefit of humanity. His life was far from easy. His father was cruel and constantly repeated to him about the greatness of the Octavius family and how unfair everything was. He was very stubborn, and his decision not to accept help from anyone led him down a tragic path. He fell from scaffolding, suffered numerous injuries, and refused to go to the hospital. Little Otto was left alone with his dying father, while his mother left to visit a friend after yet another argument with her husband. Yes, his mother didn't care about her son. So Otto spent the entire night in the house with his father's lifeless body. For sure, it affected him. He suffered a psychological trauma, but he also swore that he wouldn't die in obscurity and loneliness like his father. He decided to become a scientist and make a breakthrough benefiting humanity. However, as it usually happens, everything went downhill. While working, he used mechanical tentacle-like manipulators. The explosion fused them to his body, causing catastrophic damage to his mind. He didn't have a choice who to become. He did everything right, worked for the good. And yes, he had an inflated ego, but that didn't make him a villain. Just one accident determined everything. This might not have happened, and everything would have been fine, but the universe decided otherwise, unfortunately. And there are villains who didn't choose to be bad, they are just mentally sick and they are just needed help. Kurt Connors, the Lizard, for example. He was a very skilled surgeon that was enlisted in the army and sent to war. There, as a result of an explosion, he lost his arm. He returned home and started researching the regenerative abilities of reptiles. His goal was to find a way to give humans the same regenerative power and rid the world of disability, and of course to regenerate his lost arm. He injected lizard genes into himself and miraculously his arm grew back. But unfortunately, this triggered a mutation that transformed him into a lizard-like creature that wanted to turn everyone into beings like himself. His story is truly sad, because before becoming the lizard, Connors pursued noble goals, and even after the transformation, his intentions remained somewhat positive, but they became twisted. It's not his fault, it was an accidental outcome. His mistake was made in the pursuit of a positive result. It was a canon event beyond his control, transforming the scientist into a bloodthirsty monster. In the comics, he wore a chip to block the lizard's mind, which in case of failure would paralyze the doctor, so that the creature wouldn't harm anyone. Unfortunately, it didn't help much, and he eventually lost control. In comics, characters can't stray too far from their established image for too long.
We were gonna change the lives of millions, including my own.
Next example, McGargan, the Scorpion. He was a private detective hired by J. Jonah to find out how Peter Parker got his spider photos. To be honest, it always bothered me that Jameson didn't figure out himself. I mean, some shots could only be taken by someone in close proximity to the events, almost participating in them. Well, it's just a comics. So McGargan couldn't find out how Parker took the pictures, and instead Jameson offered him to participate in an experiment that would give the detective increased strength and a suit with a venomous stinger. Yes, in old comics Jameson was sometimes a true villain. For example, he controlled the first version of the Spider Slayer robot. However, McGargan went crazy from the serums injected into him and became a villain, whose top priority was to squash the spider, and maybe Jameson too. He was convinced that it was all safe, that he would gain strength and a bunch of money. That's what happens when you trust other people who offer you everything for free. It's sad, but often that's how life goes. But nevertheless, there are plenty of such characters. The Green Goblin became mad in both comics and movie adaptations. Electro in the movie was socially awkward, and genetic change and torture drove him completely mad. All they didn't have choice. It couldn't have turned out differently. Such villains possibly evoke even more pity and therefore become even more interesting than those who were raised in terrible conditions. They were good people who turned bad against their will. But there is a minus. Their situations are quite similar. One character has gone mad, another the same. But if a character suddenly, in the middle of life, consciously turns to the side of evil, that's when things become much more interesting. Thankfully, among Spider-Man's enemies there are some like that. And if all the previous villains often evoke pity, these guys, personally for me, may even respect. Anyway, first things first. Let's start with the Vulture. In the comics, Adrian Toomes is an excellent inventor and engineer who, along with his partner Gregory, starts a company producing electronics. As the company grows, Toomes works on his life project, essentially anti-gravity technology, no matter how it worked, but you know those wings of his very well. However, while he was inventing, his partner Gregory was taking more and more money for himself. When they quarreled over it, Gregory managed to kick Toomes out of the business, taking all his investments and hard work. And then he wanted to sell their business. It's not just unfair, it's injustice towards Toomes' life's work. So he finishes his wings and steals his own money from his ex-partner's safe. In a sense, it's morally grey, but once he tasted that easy money, the Vulture was born. However, that story is from the 80s. What we got in the adaptation is even better. Just a reminder, Adrian is an honest worker who supports his loving family and cares for his employees. These are his core values in life, much closer to ordinary people. He uses all his savings to bring order to New York after the chaos caused by heroes and villains. Then the bosses cancel his contract and he loses all his money. The workers he looked after can become unemployed. Also, his daughter can't afford to go to college. The good guys unfairly crush him and take away what matters most in his life. There weren't better options other than using alien technology.
Please, Rita, come on. Look, I bought trucks for this job. I brought in a whole new crew. These guys have a family. I have a family. I'm all in on this. I could lose my house.
I'm sorry, sir. There's nothing I can do.
That's why he chooses the dark side, to protect his values. Or we can take a slightly more complicated example, Quentin Beck, also known as Mysterio, the guy with an aquarium instead of a head. Quentin was a stuntman and special effects master in Hollywood. He was pretty good and quite possibly even a genius. Normal life, normal job, what could go wrong? It can go wrong when the most precious thing in your life is taken away from you. For Quentin, it was his ambition, and that's completely normal. everyone has different priorities in life. For some, having a family is the most important, for others it's freedom from the system, for some it's being beautiful, for others it's achieving success. We're all unique, and Quentin, it seems, deserved success in his craft. But instead he faced undeserved jokes about him from people around and indifference from Hollywood studios. In the end, fed up with this injustice, he saw Spider-Man making headlines, and someone gave Quentin the idea that if you beat the Spidey, you can become famous. And that's how Quentin came up with Mysterio. After all, criminals are talked about almost as much as movie stars. His skill was so amazing that in real life such a talent as Mysterio would be haunted by all companies. Did you know that he was the one who killed the X-Men? In the comic Old Man Logan, Mysterio used illusions to fool Wolverine, making him believe that he was surrounded by enemies, although they were members of his team. In the movie it was even better. Quentin's thirst for achievements and recognition remained, but here he worked for Stark, and holograms were his life's project. Stark essentially stole his technology, his life's work, and used it for completely different purposes. Then he simply threw Quentin out and told that he is mentally unstable.
He fired me. Said I was unstable.
How Stark came to this conclusion remains a question, because Quentin easily found 7 more mentally unstable scientists who were also mysteriously angry with Stark. Together with this team, they began their revenge and fulfilled Quentin's ambition. Certainly, these two villains could have sacrificed the most important things in their lives and lived in unhappiness. But they choose that way, even if it's bad and unacceptable. Nevertheless, they achieved their goals. Vulture became rich, temporarily, but anyway. In the movie he provided jobs for his people and paid for his daughter's education. I condemn them, but respect their determination to hold onto the most important things in their lives. And again, can we say they had a choice? To some extent, yes, but was it truly a choice? Let me know in the comments. Fortunately, sometimes the choice isn't so terrible. Let's talk about the one who started this mess with the canon events. Miguel O'Hara, also known as Spider-Man 2099. Miguel lives in Nueva York, in the distant future. All the heroes have long been gone, and the world is ruled by cyberpunk. He works at Alchemax, a company trying to recreate the abilities of heroes of the past through genetic experiments. Miguel tried to recreate the Spider-Man formula, but the experiments didn't work until he initially took a drug that caused genetic addition. In attempt to get rid of it, he wanted to cleanse his DNA using a special machine. However, his unpleasant colleague sabotaged it, and instead of cleansing, Spider-Man genes were mixed into his DNA. Unexpectedly, this gave him spider-like abilities, and he became the new Spider-Man. But I want to talk not about this moment, but about what was shown to us in the animated movie, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. There will be some small spoilers now, but I'm sure you know about them. Anyway, if you still don't want to encounter them, you can skip to the timecode on the screen. So, in the universe, Miguel lost his daughter. So to say, he passed through his canon event. But he couldn't accept this and found a convenient universe where the local O'Hara was dead and his daughter was alive. However, this provoked a cataclysm that destroyed the new reality, which prompted Miguel to study the concept of canon events. He discovered that certain deaths in the lives of spider people are predetermined. If someone from another universe intervenes to save a person meant to die, it triggers a cataclysm that destroys a universe. At least Miguel believes in it, though true it or not remains uncertain until the third part. If this theory is true, we need to accept that Miguel chooses not to save countless innocent lives to prevent the collapse of entire universe. It's a classic trolley problem. To remind you, it's a thought experiment where you are given a power to control a trolley's movement. The tracks split into two paths. On one there is one person, and on the other a group. The trolley has two paths, and you have to choose whom it will run over. Will you save the group of people or the one person? But Miguel chose to run over one unfortunate person to save not just 5 individuals, but an entire universe. Can we call him a hero in this case? It becomes a gray area of morality. He saw that intervention from other worlds led to disastrous consequences. He needed to be tough and act some way to avoid raising countless billions of people and aliens. The other Spider-Mans agreed with him on that. If it wasn't for the death of his daughter, his own canon event, he wouldn't have entered into another reality, he wouldn't have destroyed it, and there would be no events of the Spider-Verse and the Spider-Man conflict. For me, this is the most interesting type of conflict, when the main hero faces not just a villain who is evil by his nature, not a sick person who needs psychiatric help, and not a villain who chooses this dishonorable path for something most valuable in their life. Instead, we face a different hero who has his own perspective on what's happening. That, as for me, is real life.
Being Spider-Man is a sacrifice. That's the job. That's what you signed up for.
But what's also interesting is that Miguel didn't have a choice but to become an antagonist. If Miles Morales were in his place and experienced the same things, he would have taken the same path. The story of the superior Spider-Man, also known as Dr. Octopus, demonstrates the same. Yes, it's Octopus again, but in this story he is a hero. Here, Octavius took over Parker's body by swapping their consciousness. Peter died in Otto's dying body, and Dr. Octopus played the role of a hero in Peter's body. Initially, his goal was simply to survive, realizing his evil plans. However, Peter's body had an impact on him. He gained memories of Uncle Ben, for instance. Secondly, he didn't want to be recognized in Parker's body. And thirdly, let's not forget that he had a desire to be the best in everything, including being a better Spider-Man than Peter himself. And yes, the superior Spider-Man was a cruel character. To be honest, his behavior wasn't great. Let's remember, he was hitting people in a terrifying way. Despite this, he did act as a hero by saving people and New York. In the end, he made a noble sacrifice to restore Peter's control over his body, as Peter's consciousness was still present within him. So due to another twist of fate, the villain became an anti-hero. Did he want this? Did Otto choose to become an anti-hero? No, life forces us not only to fall to the dark side, but also vice versa. Now you might say, well, they are different people with different predispositions and all that. It's not about their surroundings, upbringing or events. Everyone has a choice. Okay, let's look at the example of Peter Parker. You know this famous phrase.
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
With great power comes great responsibility.
She told me that with great power comes great responsibility.
But you know what? All these allegories are quite a strange thing. The same can be as well said to a gangster who finds great power in brotherhood and Thompson, representing great responsibility for his own family. It can be also said to Thanos, who possesses immense power and has responsibility for the entire universe. So it's not just about the phrase, it's about the context. In the classic Spider-Man context, after gaining his powers, he acted irresponsibly and failed to stop the criminal who later killed his uncle.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
This led to the loss of what was the most important in his life, and he started blaming himself, instead of pointing fingers at others. Through this, he understood his responsibility for the lives of others. Now let's briefly explore how others from the new movie formed in a similar way. Miles grew up in good conditions, but he became a hero when Peter Parker, before his death, asked him to do what he couldn't to save the city from destruction. Gwen, after getting bitten by a spider, initially used her abilities saving people just for fun. But when Peter Parker transformed into the lizard and died in a battle with her, she realized the seriousness of heroism. She understood that it's not a game, and if things go wrong, someone will die. First, let me emphasize again that they didn't have a direct choice. It wasn't their deliberate decision, it was just a random outcome. They didn't have control over it. Now let's go back to Parker. What if another person killed his uncle? Spider-Man wouldn't take the responsibility upon himself and would seek revenge without hesitation, because his fault for his uncle's death wasn't obvious.
Did you give him a chance? Did you?
The classic noir Spider-Man excellently describes this topic, but the situation is slightly different there. Uncle Ben wasn't killed because of the indirect fault of Parker. He was cold-bloodedly murdered for feeding some local vulture. Additionally, it turned out that Parker's mentor was secretly working for Uncle Ben's killer. This completely broke Parker, and he took guns, seeking revenge without hesitation. The context changed, as well as the heroism of the character. There is a darker version. It was in our favorite 90s animated series, which ended with its own multiverse 25 years ago. Among the Spider-Man from different universes, there was a billionaire, playboy, philanthropist in an iron suit, Iron Spider, although he doesn't call himself that. This Peter had an inflated ego, and his arrogance reached a sky-high level.
A gas missile will take care of him! No! Wait! Why did you do that? What were you thinking?
Hey, relax. This'll all work out. Things always do.
In his universe, Uncle Ben's death didn't happen. He stopped the robber, so he didn't grasp the meaning of the words about great responsibility. He became famous, didn't carry the burden of guilt for the death of a loved one, so saving people wasn't his top priority. The core that reinforced those words wasn't there, and he just got spoiled. But there was also a Carnage Spider. Peter from another universe was going through a tough time. Carnage got attached to him, driving him insane, as often happens with his enemies. After watching this, it seems like great power can lead to great mental problems. However, these examples show us that these characters didn't choose who they become. So, we looked at Spider-Man's villains and heroes, at Spider-Man himself. We tried to understand what led them to become who they are. Upbringing, environment, perhaps a crucial event? The answer is all of it. Among all this, their own choice is missing. Circumstances always shape a person. Neither you nor I could truly choose who we become. Seemingly insignificant events influence our lives and the choices we make. No one chooses where and how they were born. We don't even choose our parents, and looking at all this, we shape our own personality. The characters I talked about didn't choose who they become. They believed they did, but in reality they were either lucky or unlucky. So does free choice exist? Honestly, I don't know. I talked about comic book characters. They are all products of human imagination. The scriptwriter ordered Uncle Ben's death and he died. Doc Octopus' experiment didn't go as planned because the scriptwriter needed a crazy villain scientist with mechanical tentacles and so on. But since there are so many similar characters, perhaps it's buried deep within us. Maybe deep down in our souls we know that we aren't given the choice to shape our destiny. However, I personally believe that while we may not be able to choose who we become, we can control the probabilities. Yes, under the influence of circumstances and other people, but we can control it. We can get rid of toxic relationships, transfer to a better school or college. Then, on our path, we will more often encounter people who change us for the better. People whose lives turned out for the better. Maybe you, the one watching this video right now, are that kind of person. Perhaps with a small action you've already changed someone's life for the better. Or maybe you will do it in the future. Every action has consequences, and I hope those consequences will be positive. I hope that maybe I am wrong and we can choose our path. At least I want to believe that we can influence it somehow. And you know who influenced the creation of this video? Of course, the viewers. So thank you for your likes and comments. Take care.